Hello everyone. Tonight I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now let's begin. The Lullaby Rig from Marcus Sullivan. I've been driving long haul for 37 years, and in all that time I've never encountered an engine that could sing. Not metaphorically, mind you. I'm talking about honest-to-goodness melodies rising from under the hood, soft and haunting as a mother's lullaby. It started 3 weeks ago when I picked up that peculiar freight hauler from the abandoned lot outside Bakersfield. A 1987 Peterbilt 359 with more rust than paint and a history nobody wanted to discuss. The dispatcher at the yard, a nervous young man with coffee-stained fingers, barely looked me in the eye when he handed over the keys. "She's been sitting here for months," he muttered, shuffling through paperwork that seemed to make him uncomfortable. "Previous owner just stopped coming around. Company needs her moved to the depot in Flagstaff." When I asked about maintenance records or the owner's whereabouts, he simply shrugged and walked away, leaving me standing in the gravel lot with nothing but questions and the steady whisper of desert wind through chain-link fencing. The Peterbilt looked tired, her chrome dulled by years of highway salt and sun, but when I turned the key for the first time, she came alive with surprising vigor. The diesel engine caught immediately, settling into a deep rhythmic purr that seemed almost too smooth for a rig with over 800,000 miles on the odometer. I adjusted the mirrors, checked the air brakes, and pulled out onto Highway 58 as the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the Tehachapi Mountains. For the first few hours, everything felt routine. The engine hummed its familiar mechanical song, pistons firing, turbocharger whistling, transmission shifting with well-worn precision. I made good time through the Mojave, watching the landscape shift from scrubland to desert as twilight painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. It wasn't until I stopped for fuel in Barstow that I noticed the first oddity. When I shut off the engine, it seemed to take longer than usual to truly go quiet, as if some deeper rhythm continued pulsing beneath the silence. The night clerk at the truck stop was a weathered woman with kind eyes who commented on the Peterbilt as I paid for diesel. "Haven't seen one of those 359s in a while," she said, peering through the window at my rig. "They don't make them like that anymore. Bet she's got some stories to tell." I agreed, thinking it was just friendly conversation, but something in her expression suggested she might have meant it more literally than I initially understood. Back on the road, I merged onto Interstate 40 and settled in for the long stretch across the desert. The CB radio crackled occasionally with distant conversations between other drivers, their voices fading in and out like ghosts in the static. The dashboard lights cast everything in a warm orange glow, and the steady vibration of the road beneath my wheels created that hypnotic rhythm that every long-haul driver knows. Part meditation, part endurance test. It was somewhere east of Needles, in that vast emptiness between desert towns, that I first heard it. I'd been driving for 6 hours straight and was considering a rest stop when a sound drifted up from the engine bay that made me ease off the accelerator and tilt my head, listening. Beneath the familiar diesel rumble was something else entirely. A soft, melodic humming that rose and fell with an almost musical cadence, as if the engine itself had learned to sing. At first, I convinced myself it was just the turbocharger creating an unusual harmonic, or perhaps wind moving through some loose component in an unexpected way. But as I listened more carefully, the sound began to resolve into something unmistakably intentional. A lullaby of sorts, wordless but achingly beautiful, with phrases that repeated and developed like a composition someone had spent years perfecting. I pulled into a rest area near Kingman to investigate, popping the hood and shining my flashlight into the engine compartment. Everything appeared normal. The Detroit Diesel 60 series sat exactly where it should, oil levels fine, coolant reservoir full, belts tight and properly aligned. But when I started her up again, the singing resumed immediately. even more clearly audible now that I was standing directly beside the engine. The melody seemed to emanate from deep within the block itself, as if the metal had somehow learned to carry a tune through its very molecular structure. I called my dispatcher from the rest area payphone, describing what I was hearing, but his response was predictably dismissive. "Engines make all kinds of noises, Sullivan. As long as she's running smooth and your gauges look good, just keep rolling. That freight needs to be in Flagstaff by morning." When I pressed him for more information about the previous driver, the line went quiet for so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Finally, he said, "Just deliver the load, Marcus. Some questions are better left unasked." The singing continued as I pulled back onto the highway, growing more complex and nuanced with each passing mile. Different sections of the melody would emerge and recede like voices in a choir, sometimes harmonizing with the primary theme, sometimes providing a haunting counterpoint that made my chest tighten with emotions I couldn't quite name. There was something deeply familiar about the tune, as if I'd heard it in dreams or half-remembered childhood moments, but I couldn't place where or when. Near Williams, Arizona, I encountered another driver at a truck stop who recognized the Peterbilt immediately. He was an older man named Ray, with silver hair and hands that spoke of decades gripping steering wheels. And when he saw my rig, his face went pale. "You're driving Sarah's truck," he said quietly, approaching my cab with obvious reluctance. "Haven't seen her since the accident." When I asked what accident, he looked around nervously and lowered his voice. "She used to sing while she drove, you know. Beautiful voice, like something from the radio. Said it kept her company on the long runs, kept the loneliness at bay." Ray explained that Sarah Chen had been a fixture on this route for nearly 20 years, known throughout the trucking community for her kindness and the way she hummed or sang softly over the CB during late-night conversations. One night about 4 months ago, other drivers started reporting strange transmissions on her channel. He continued, his weathered face grave in the fluorescent truck stop lighting. Her voice singing those old lullabies she loved, but the signal was coming through even when her radio was supposedly off. Then one morning, they found her truck parked perfectly at a rest stop outside Flagstaff. Engine running, logbook up to date, but Sarah was nowhere to be found. A chill ran down my spine as Ray spoke, and I found myself glancing toward the Peterbilt as if expecting to see someone in the cab. "What do you think happened to her?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Ray shrugged, but his eyes held a sadness that suggested he had his own theories. "Some folks say she just decided to walk away from trucking, started a new life somewhere. But those of us who knew her, well, we know she wouldn't have abandoned that rig. That truck was her home, her partner, her whole world rolled into one." As I prepared to leave, Ray grabbed my arm gently. "Listen, Marcus, you seem like a decent fellow, so I'm going to give you some advice. If that engine starts singing louder, if the melodies get too beautiful or too sad, you find a place to park and walk away. Some things in this world are meant to call us home, and not all homes are places the living should follow." His words stayed with me as I climbed back into the cab and fired up the engine, which immediately resumed its ethereal singing with what seemed like renewed enthusiasm. The final stretch to Flagstaff took me through high desert country, where ponderosa pines started appearing alongside the Joshua trees and the air carried the clean scent of mountain snow. The engine's song had evolved into something extraordinarily complex by now, with multiple melodic lines weaving together in harmonies that seemed almost too sophisticated for mechanical coincidence. Sometimes I could swear I heard actual words buried in the music, fragments of old songs, whispered names, bits of conversation carried on frequencies that shouldn't exist. As dawn approached and the lights of Flagstaff appeared in the distance, the singing reached a crescendo that filled the entire cab with sound so beautiful, it brought tears to my eyes. For a moment, I felt an overwhelming urge to pull over and simply listen, to let the melodies wash over me until they carried away every worry and responsibility I'd ever carried. The desire was so strong that I actually took my foot off the accelerator and started scanning for a place to stop. But then I remembered Ray's warning. and with tremendous effort I forced myself to maintain speed and focus on reaching the depot. The singing seemed to sense my resistance, growing more urgent and pleading, as if the engine itself was desperately trying to convince me to stay. The eyes that never blink from Marcus. I've been hauling freight across the Midwest for 23 years now, and in all that time, I thought I'd seen everything the highways could throw at me. Drunk drivers weaving between lanes, deer frozen in my headlight beams, fog so thick you could cut it with a knife. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened on that stretch of Interstate 80 through Nebraska last October. The night started ordinary enough. I was pulling a load of electronics from Denver to Chicago, running about 4 hours behind schedule thanks to a blown tire outside of Sterling. The replacement had eaten into my driving time, and I was pushing hard to make up the difference before I hit my mandatory rest period. My Peterbilt 379 was humming along at a steady 70, her Detroit diesel purring like a well-fed cat beneath the hood. The CB was quiet except for the occasional trucker checking on road conditions ahead, and the classic rock station out of Omaha was playing something soft and familiar that helped keep my eyes from getting heavy. It was one of those perfect autumn nights where the air is crisp but not yet cold, and the sky stretches out forever above you, like black velvet studded with diamonds. I had both windows cracked just enough to let in the fresh air, mixing with the familiar scent of diesel fumes and the worn leather of my driver's seat. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, illuminated by my headlights cutting through the darkness, and for a while, I felt that familiar peace that comes with long-haul driving when everything is going just right. That's when I first noticed the other truck in my mirrors. At first, it was just another set of headlights. Maybe a mile back, nothing unusual about that. Trucks travel this route all night long, and it's not uncommon to have company for stretches of highway. But as the miles rolled by, I started paying more attention to those lights. They maintained the exact same distance behind me, never getting closer, never falling back. When I sped up to pass a slower vehicle, they sped up. When I settled back into the right lane, they did the same. The strangest part was the headlights themselves. Most modern trucks have those bright LED or HID lights that throw out a harsh white or bluish beam. But these were different. They had an odd, warm quality to them. Almost amber, but with something else I couldn't quite place. Every now and then, when I glanced in my side mirror during a curve or when cresting a hill, the lights seemed to flicker slightly, like they were adjusting focus or something. After about 50 miles of this, I decided to test my suspicions. I clicked on my CB radio and tried hailing the driver behind me. "Hey there, driver in the big rig about a mile back, you got your ears on?" Static filled the cab for a moment, then nothing. I tried again with the same result. Not unusual, really. Plenty of drivers don't run with their CBs on, or maybe he was on a different channel. I decided to slow down a bit, drop my speed to about 65 and see if he'd pass. As I eased off the throttle, I watched my mirrors carefully. The lights behind me grew larger, closer, but just as they should have been moving into the left lane to overtake me, they slowed down too, maintaining that same distance. The behavior was starting to unnerve me more than I cared to admit. We continued this strange dance for another hour, through small towns whose lights twinkled briefly in the distance before disappearing behind us. The radio had turned to static between stations, leaving me with only the sound of my own engine and the whisper of wind through the cracked windows. I tried adjusting my mirrors to get a better look at the truck behind me, but every time I thought I could make out more details, the angle would shift or a gentle curve in the road would change the perspective. It was near the town of Big Springs that I first realized something was seriously wrong. I was coming over a long, gradual hill when I glanced in my driver's side mirror during a slight left bend in the highway. For just a moment, the angle was perfect and I could see those headlights clearly. They weren't just flickering randomly like I'd thought. They were blinking in a slow, deliberate pattern, and not like turn signals or hazard lights. These blinked like, well, like eyes. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the October air. I blinked hard, figuring fatigue was starting to play tricks on me, and looked again. The lights were steady now, just normal headlights following at a normal distance. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it, that the stress of running behind schedule in the late hour were making me see things that weren't there. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. The pattern continued for the next 50 miles. Whenever I'd catch those lights at just the right angle, they would blink slowly and deliberately. Sometimes both at once, sometimes alternating left and right, always with the same organic rhythm, like breathing, like a heartbeat, like something alive was behind those lights watching me. I started to feel genuinely afraid, though I couldn't articulate exactly why. It was just another truck, after all. Maybe the driver had some kind of electrical problem, or maybe it was some new kind of adaptive headlight system I wasn't familiar with. But the rational explanations felt thin and hollow against the growing dread in my chest. As we approached North Platte, I decided to pull off at the next truck stop. Whatever was going on, I needed to see this other driver face to face. Needed to convince myself that there was nothing supernatural about the situation. The Flying J at the North Platte exit was well lit and busy. Exactly the kind of place where weird highway mysteries evaporate under fluorescent lights and the mundane reality of other people going about their normal business. I put on my turn signal well in advance and began slowing for the exit. In my mirrors, I watched the lights behind me. For a moment, they continued straight, and I felt a wave of relief. Maybe it had all been coincidence, maybe the other driver was just headed further down the road. But then, at the last possible moment, those amber lights swung toward the exit ramp, following me into the truck stop. My heart was hammering now as I found a parking spot near the back of the lot. I shut down the engine and sat in the sudden quiet, listening to the tick of cooling metal and watching my mirrors. The other truck had followed me into the lot but hadn't parked. Instead, it was moving slowly through the rows of parked vehicles, those strange headlights sweeping back and forth like searchlights. That's when I got the best look yet at what was following me, and what I saw made my blood turn to ice water. The truck itself seemed normal enough from a distance, a dark-colored semi that could have been any one of a dozen manufacturers. But the headlights, they weren't headlights at all. They were eyes. Enormous amber eyes that blinked slowly and deliberately as the truck moved through the parking lot. Clearly searching for something, searching for me. I sat frozen in my cab, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. The thing that looked like a truck was moving closer now, turning down my row. Those terrible eyes blinking in that same organic rhythm I'd been watching for hours. As it approached, I could see that the pupils contracted and dilated, adjusting to focus on different parked trucks, examining each one carefully. When those eyes fixed on my truck, the pupils dilated wide, and I swear I could feel the weight of an intelligence behind them, alien and hungry and focused entirely on me. The thing that wasn't quite a truck stopped about 50 feet away and just watched me, those massive eyes blinking slowly, patiently, like a cat watching a mouse hole. I don't know how long we sat there in that awful staring contest, but eventually my survival instincts kicked in. Moving as slowly and quietly as possible, I reached for my ignition key. The thing's pupils dilated further, tracking my movement, and I knew it was aware of what I was doing, but I had to try. I couldn't just sit there forever. I turned the key and my Detroit diesel rumbled to life. Immediately, the creature began moving toward me, no longer maintaining the pretense of being just another truck. It accelerated with impossible smoothness, those eyes never blinking now, pupils contracted to tight points of focused hatred. I threw the truck into gear and floored it, not caring about the posted speed limits in the parking lot or the other drivers who might be trying to sleep. Behind me, I could hear something that might have been an engine sound, but was probably something else entirely. Something organic and wet and angry. I didn't look back until I was on the highway again. And when I did, I saw those eyes in my mirrors, closer than they'd ever been, filling the entire view with amber light and malevolent intelligence. What happened next was the longest, most terrifying hour of my life. The cartographer's route from Marcus Chen. The GPS on my dashboard had been acting up for 3 days straight when I found the old paper map tucked behind the sun visor of my Peterbilt. I'd bought the rig used from a dealer in Bakersfield, and the previous owner had left behind the usual detritus of long-haul life. A cracked coffee mug, some old CB radio manuals, and apparently this map. It was folded with the kind of precise creases that spoke of years of careful handling. The paper thick and yellowed like parchment, with a texture that felt almost organic beneath my fingertips. The rain had been falling steadily since I crossed into Oregon, turning the interstate into a river of red taillights and hissing spray. My windshield wipers beat their monotonous rhythm against the glass while the engine hummed its familiar diesel lullaby. I was hauling refrigerated pharmaceuticals from Seattle to Phoenix, a run I'd made dozens of times, but tonight felt different. The familiar weight of exhaustion pressed against my shoulders as I squinted through the rain-streaked windshield at the cascade of brake lights stretching endlessly ahead. That's when I remembered the map. With traffic moving at barely 15 miles per hour, I had plenty of time to unfold it across my steering wheel. The moment I spread it open, I noticed something peculiar. The cartography was exquisite, hand-drawn with an attention to detail that put modern GPS systems to shame. Every curve of every back road was rendered in delicate ink lines, complete with elevation markers, bridge specifications, and even notes about seasonal road conditions. But what caught my attention immediately were the small red dots scattered across various routes, each one marked with what appeared to be a date and time. The dots looked fresh, as if they'd been added recently, though the map itself was clearly decades old. Some were bright crimson, others had faded to a rusty brown, but they all had that same wet appearance as if the ink hadn't quite dried. I traced my finger along one of the marked routes, a winding path through the Cascade foothills that would cut nearly 200 miles off my journey to Phoenix. The red dots followed this route like breadcrumbs, each one positioned at what appeared to be rest stops, scenic overlooks, or small towns. The traffic jam showed no signs of clearing, and my delivery deadline was already tight. I found myself studying the alternate route more carefully, noting how it connected to Highway 58 just south of Eugene, then wound through a series of mountain passes I'd never heard of before, threading back to I-5 near the California border. The map indicated it was a truck-friendly route, with notes about grade percentages and weight restrictions written in the same meticulous handwriting that had added the red dots. When another semi jackknifed 2 miles ahead, bringing traffic to a complete standstill, I made my decision. The next exit was coming up in half a mile, and according to the map, it would connect to the alternate route. I folded the map carefully, noting how it wanted to crease along its original lines, and tucked it into my shirt pocket. The paper felt warm against my chest, almost body temperature, though I attributed that to the truck's heater working overtime against the October chill. The exit ramp led to a narrow 2-lane road that immediately began climbing into densely forested hills. My headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, illuminating towering Douglas firs whose branches formed a canopy so thick that the rain barely penetrated to the asphalt below. The silence was profound after hours of highway noise. Even with my windows up, I could hear the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant sound of water running somewhere in the darkness. I'd been driving the mountain road for about 30 minutes when I reached the first red dot on the map. It marked a small pullout beside what appeared to be a historical marker, though my headlights couldn't penetrate far enough through the trees to make out what it commemorated. I slowed the truck and considered stopping to check my progress on the map, but something about the pullout made me uneasy. The trees seemed to lean inward there, creating shadows that moved independently of the wind, and I thought I caught a glimpse of something pale standing just beyond the reach of my lights. I pressed on, following the winding road as it carved deeper into the mountains. The map had been remarkably accurate so far, every turn and landmark appearing exactly where indicated. but I began to notice that each time I passed one of the marked red dots, my finger tingled where I'd touched the map. At first, it was just a mild sensation, like a small static shock, but as I continued along the route, the tingling intensified and spread up my arm. The second red dot corresponded to an abandoned gas station, its pumps standing like chrome sentinels in my headlights. The building's windows were dark, and weeds grew through cracks in the concrete, but a hand-painted sign reading "Last Chance Fuel" was still visible on the weathered facade. As I passed, I noticed that one of the windows wasn't dark after all. A faint reddish glow emanated from somewhere inside, pulsing with the same rhythm as my heartbeat. By the time I reached the third marked location, the tingling had become a burning sensation that seemed to follow the path of my circulatory system. I pulled the map from my pocket to check my progress, and in the green glow of my dashboard lights, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. The red dots weren't ink at all. They were actual drops of blood, and they were spreading across the paper like some kind of infection, creating new marks along my route even as I watched. I should have turned around then. Every instinct I'd developed in 20 years of long-haul driving was screaming at me to get back to the interstate, to stick to the well-traveled roads where other truckers' CB chatter provided a constant reminder that I wasn't alone in the darkness. But the burning sensation in my arm had become something else, something that felt almost like hunger, and I found myself pressing harder on the accelerator instead of reaching for the brake. The fourth red dot appeared just as the map indicated, at a scenic overlook that provided a view of the valley below. But when I looked down from the mountain road, the valley wasn't empty. Hundreds of lights dotted the darkness, arranged in perfect geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. They pulsed in unison, and I realized with growing horror that they were beating in time with the burning sensation in my arm, which had now spread throughout my entire body. I pulled the map out again, and this time I could see my own location marked with a fresh drop of blood that seemed to well up from the paper itself. More disturbing still, I could see blood drops forming ahead of my current position, mapping out the rest of my journey in real time. The route led to what appeared to be a small town called Sanguine Falls, though I was certain no such place had existed when I'd first examined the map. The road began to descend into the valley, and the geometric lights resolved themselves into street lamps and building windows. Sanguine Falls looked like any other small mountain community, complete with a main street lined with shops, a few residential streets branching off into the surrounding forest, and even a small truck stop with an attached diner. Everything appeared normal except for the complete absence of any people or vehicles, and the fact that every light source cast the same reddish glow I'd noticed at the abandoned gas station. I parked my rig at the truck stop, though I couldn't say exactly why. The burning sensation in my body had faded to a warm, almost pleasant tingling, and I felt more relaxed than I had in months. The map lay open on my passenger seat, and I could see that Sanguine Falls was marked not with a single red dot, but with an elaborate crimson mandala that seemed to shift and writhe when I looked at it directly. The diner's neon sign buzzed and flickered, casting alternating shadows across the empty parking lot. Through the windows, I could see that the interior was fully lit, and steam rose from coffee pots on warming plates. A handwritten sign in the window read, "Truckers welcome always open," but I couldn't shake the feeling that the welcome wasn't meant for people like me. At least not anymore. I was reaching for the door handle when I noticed my reflection in the side mirror. My skin had taken on a pale, translucent quality, and dark lines were visible beneath the surface, following the path of my veins and arteries in perfect detail. When I held up my hand to examine it more closely, I could see the same reddish glow emanating from within, pulsing gently like a dying ember. That's when I understood what the map really was, and what had happened to the previous owner of my truck. The cartographer hadn't been documenting routes through the mountains. He'd been documenting the spread of something else entirely, marking each point where the infection had taken hold, each location where another traveler had been drawn into the network of lights that connected this hidden valley. To the world above. The mark on metal from Jake Morrison. The handprint appeared on my hood somewhere between Bakersfield and Barstow, pressed into the white paint of my Peterbilt like someone had leaned against it, while the metal was still hot from the foundry. I noticed it during my mandatory rest stop at a truck plaza that squatted beside Interstate 40 like a neon oasis in the Mojave darkness. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I walked around my rig for the pre-trip inspection I'd done 1,000 times before, checking tire pressure and looking for loose bolts. When the mark caught my eye, it was perfect, too perfect. 5 fingers and a palm pressed against the metal with such precision that I could see the whorls of fingerprints etched into the paint. The strange thing was, the handprint wasn't dirty or greasy like you'd expect from someone touching a truck. Instead, it seemed to have been burned into the surface, the white paint around it slightly discolored as if exposed to intense heat. I ran my own hand over it, and the metal beneath felt cold despite the desert air still radiating warmth from the day's brutal sun. I'd been driving this route for 8 years, hauling electronics from Los Angeles to distribution centers scattered across the Southwest, and I knew every mile marker, every rest stop, every place where the highway patrol liked to set up their scales. My truck was my pride, a 2019 Peterbilt 579 that I kept cleaner than most people keep their kitchens. The idea that someone had touched it, marked it, without my knowledge sent an uncomfortable chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the desert's sudden temperature drop. The truck plaza was nearly empty at 2 in the morning. Just a handful of rigs parked in the sprawling lot like sleeping giants. The convenience store's neon sign flickered erratically, casting intermittent shadows that danced across the asphalt. I walked inside, the electronic chime announcing my arrival to the clerk who barely looked up from his phone. The coffee was old and bitter, but I needed the caffeine for the long stretch ahead. As I paid, I asked the clerk if he'd seen anyone around my truck. "Lot's pretty quiet tonight," he said, his voice carrying the flat disinterest of someone who'd worked too many graveyard shifts. "You having problems?" "Someone left a handprint on my hood," I explained, gesturing toward the lot. "Wondering if you saw anything on your cameras." He glanced at the bank of monitors behind the counter, their screens showing various angles of the parking area in grainy black and white. "Camera's been acting up all week. Management keeps saying they'll fix them, but you know how that goes." He shrugged, already losing interest in my problem. "Could have been someone looking for directions, maybe checking under your hood for something." But that explanation didn't sit right with me. The handprint was positioned wrong for someone trying to lift the hood, and besides, I always kept my truck locked when I wasn't in the cab. As I walked back across the lot, my footsteps echoing in the stillness, I noticed how the other drivers had parked their rigs. They were all clustered near the building, drawn to the light and the illusion of safety it provided. My Peterbilt sat alone at the far edge of the lot, where I'd positioned it out of habit to make the morning departure easier. The handprint seemed to glow under the parking lot lights, more pronounced now than when I'd first discovered it. I tried rubbing it with my sleeve, then with a cloth from my cleaning supplies, but the mark remained as vivid as ever. The metal around it felt different too, not just cold but almost electric, like touching the screen of an old television. I found myself staring at it longer than I should have, tracing the outline with my eyes, trying to determine if the hand belonged to a man or woman, an adult or child. Getting back on the road felt like the right choice, the logical response to an unsolvable mystery. The highway stretched ahead in perfect straightness, divided by yellow lines that disappeared into the darkness beyond my headlights. The familiar hum of the diesel engine and the gentle sway of the cab usually helped me settle into the rhythm of night driving, but tonight something felt different. Every few miles I found myself leaning forward to peer through the windshield at the hood, checking to see if the handprint was still there. It was always there, but it seemed to be changing. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, shadows cast by oncoming traffic or the occasional overhead sign. But as the miles passed and the desert landscape rolled by in endless sameness, I became convinced that the fingers were starting to spread, as if the hand was attempting to grip the metal. The thumb, which had initially been pressed flat against the hood, now appeared slightly raised, creating a small shadow in the paint. The radio crackled with the usual late-night chatter between drivers, reports of construction delays and speed traps, the lonely voices of people who spent their lives moving through the darkness. I considered calling in to ask if anyone else had experienced something similar, but the words stuck in my throat. How do you explain something that sounds impossible even to yourself? Instead, I turned up the volume and let the voices fill the cab, grateful for the reminder that I wasn't completely alone on this stretch of highway. Near Ludlow, I passed another truck parked on the shoulder with its hazard lights blinking. The driver stood beside his rig, waving a flashlight in the universal signal for assistance. I began to slow down, reaching for the radio to call it in, when I saw his truck's hood in my headlights. There was a handprint on it, identical to the one on my Peterbilt, positioned in exactly the same spot. The driver turned toward my truck as I passed, and in the brief moment when my headlights illuminated his face, I saw an expression of such desperate confusion that it made my stomach clench. I should have stopped. Every rule of the road, every piece of trucker etiquette I'd learned over the years, demanded that I pull over and offer help. But something primitive and instinctual kept my foot on the accelerator, urging me to put distance between my truck and whatever was happening on that dark shoulder. In my mirrors, I watched the stranded driver's flashlight grow smaller until it disappeared entirely, swallowed by the desert night. The handprint on my hood was definitely moving now, the fingers slowly spreading wider as if testing their grip on the metal. I could see it clearly in the reflection cast by roadside light poles, and each time I looked, the position had shifted slightly. The palm seemed deeper too, pressed harder into the paint, and I started to worry that whatever was causing this might actually damage the surface. More than that, though, I was beginning to feel watched, as if invisible eyes were studying me through the windshield. My CB radio burst to life with panicked chatter from drivers scattered across the interstate. Someone near Needles reported a handprint on his trailer doors. Another voice from the eastbound lanes described the same mark on his fuel tank. The reports kept coming, each one describing identical prints in different locations on their rigs, and with each transmission, the voices grew more frightened. One driver claimed he'd seen the handprint moving, fingers flexing against his windshield from the outside while he was driving 70 miles per hour. That's when I noticed the temperature inside my cab beginning to drop. The climate control showed normal readings, but my breath started to form small clouds in the air, and frost began appearing around the edges of the windshield despite the desert heat outside. The handprint on my hood was now clearly visible as a dark outline against the white paint, and as I watched, horrified, I could see condensation forming around it as if something warm was breathing against the cold metal. The radio chatter had become a cacophony of frightened voices, drivers abandoning their routes and seeking shelter at truck stops, some reporting that their rigs wouldn't start when they tried to flee. I pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing my Peterbilt beyond safe speeds, desperate to reach the lights of Barstow still 30 miles ahead. The engine responded smoothly, but I could feel something changing in the truck's handling, a subtle resistance as if invisible hands were trying to steer me toward the shoulder. In the distance, I could see another truck parked sideways across both lanes of the highway, its driver nowhere to be seen. As I approached, I realized I would have to stop or risk a collision, but when I applied the brakes, nothing happened. The pedal went to the floor with no resistance, and my speed barely decreased. Panic flooded through me as I reached for the emergency brake. But before I could pull it, the abandoned truck simply faded away like morning mist, leaving the highway clear and empty ahead. I managed to reach Barstow as dawn broke over the mountains, my hands shaking as I pulled into the first truck stop I could find. The parking lot was crowded with rigs, more than I'd ever seen at this location, and I realized these were the drivers who'd fled their routes during the night. The rhythm of the road from Marcus. The brake pedal started pulsing somewhere outside of Bakersfield, a steady thrum beneath my boot that felt like a heartbeat against the soul. I'd been driving rigs for 23 years, hauling everything from produced to prefab homes across the western states, and I knew every sound, every vibration, every quirk that a truck could throw at you. This wasn't mechanical failure. This was something else entirely. The night had begun routinely enough. I was northbound on the 99 with a load of almonds destined for Portland, my trusty Kenworth W900 humming along at a steady 65. The dashboard lights cast their familiar amber glow across the cab, and the CB radio crackled with the occasional exchange between drivers scattered across the highway. Rain had been threatening all evening, building up in heavy clouds that blocked out the stars. But so far, only a light mist kissed the windshield, just enough to warrant the intermittent wipers. I first noticed the pulsing when I came up behind. A slower-moving vehicle, some tourist in a sedan doing 50 in the right lane. As I pressed down on the brake pedal to adjust my speed, I felt it. A gentle, rhythmic throbbing that seemed to push back against my foot. Not the grinding or squealing you'd expect from worn brake pads. Not the spongy give of air in the lines. This felt organic, alive, like pressing against the throat of some massive creature. At first, I attributed it to road fatigue. When you've been behind the wheel for 8 hours straight, your mind starts playing tricks on you. Shadows move in, your peripheral vision. Road signs seem to shift their messages, and mechanical sounds take on unsettling qualities. I had experienced it all before. But as the miles rolled by, the pulsing grew more pronounced, more insistent, until it became impossible to ignore. Each time I needed to slow down, there it was. Pulse, pulse, pulse. Steady as a metronome, consistent as a drummer keeping time. The rhythm was hypnotic in its regularity, about 60 beats per minute, slow and deliberate like the resting heart rate of something very large and very calm. I found myself timing it against my watch during a brief stop at a way station, and the precision was unnerving. Not approximately 60 beats per minute, but exactly 60, never varying by more than a fraction of a second. The rain began in earnest as I merged back onto the highway, transforming the road into a ribbon of reflected light. The drops drummed against the cab in an irregular patter that stood in stark contrast to the metronomic pulsing beneath my foot. I leaned forward, peering through the rain-streaked windshield, and that's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The wipers were moving in perfect synchronization with the brake pedal's pulse. This couldn't be coincidence. The wiper, motor, and the brake system were completely separate, with no mechanical connection between them. Yet there they were, sweeping back and forth in that same 60-beat rhythm, clearing the windshield with methodical precision that seemed almost deliberate. I reached for the wiper control, intending to change the interval, but my hand hesitated over the switch. Something deep in my gut warned me not to disrupt whatever was happening. The CB radio had gone quiet, which was unusual for this stretch of highway. Normally, you'd hear truckers calling out Smokey Bears, sharing road conditions, or just chatting to stay alert during the long night hours. But now there was only static, a soft white noise that seemed to pulse in rhythm with everything else. I grabbed the microphone and called out a standard check. Breaker 19, this is northbound Kenworth at mile marker 210. Anybody got their ears on? Silence. Not even static now, just a dead emptiness that pressed against my eardrums like cotton. I fiddled with the squelch and volume controls, but the radio remained stubbornly mute. Outside, the rain continued its assault on the windshield, and the wipers kept their hypnotic tempo. And beneath my right foot, the brake pedal maintained its steady pulse like the heartbeat of some sleeping giant. It was then that I began to notice the other vehicles on the road, or rather, the lack of them. The highway had been moderately busy when I'd left the way station, the usual mix of late-night commuters and fellow long haulers pushing through to make their delivery schedules. But now the road stretched empty in both directions, a glistening black void that seemed to swallow my headlight beams. Even the opposing traffic had vanished, leaving me alone with the pulsing and the rain, and a growing sense that something fundamental had shifted in the world around me. The mile markers continued their steady countdown, confirming that I was still making progress, still moving through familiar territory. But the landscape beyond the reach of my headlights had taken on an alien quality. The usual roadside fixtures, gas stations, truck stops, billboards, had disappeared, replaced by an endless expanse of darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. Even the reflective lane markers appeared dim and widely spaced, as if the road itself was stretching like taffy. I tried to focus on the mechanics of driving, the familiar routine of watching mirrors, monitoring gauges, maintaining speed. But the pulsing beneath my foot demanded attention, growing stronger and more insistent with each mile. It felt like a message being tapped out in some primal code, a communication from something vast and patient that was trying to establish contact. The rhythm never varied, never faltered, never gave any indication of what it might want or where it might be coming from. The temperature gauge caught my eye, its needle sitting exactly in the middle of the normal range, but somehow that perfect positioning seemed wrong. Too perfect, too precise, like everything else that was happening. I glanced at the other gauges and felt a chill run down my spine. The oil pressure, the voltage, the fuel level, all sitting at precisely their midpoint positions, all rock steady despite the normal fluctuations you'd expect from a working engine. That's when I realized that even the engine's sound had changed. The familiar rumble of the diesel had smoothed out into something almost musical, a low harmonic drone that seemed to resonate in my chest cavity. The turbos whistle, the transmissions whine, the subtle clicking of the injectors, all had been replaced by this orchestral hum that rose and fell in slow, measured waves. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, like hearing the song of some mechanical whale calling across an ocean of asphalt. I needed to stop, to get out and inspect the truck, to break whatever spell was settling over me and my rig. But every time I looked for an exit ramp or a rest area, I found only more empty highways stretching ahead. The GPS screen showed my position as a small blue dot moving along the expected route, but the usual points of interest had vanished from the display. No gas stations, no restaurants, no truck stops marked along the path ahead, just a thin blue line extending into digital nothingness. The realization hit me gradually, like dawn creeping across a landscape. I was being guided. The pulsing brake, pedal, the synchronized wipers, the harmonized engine note. They were all part of some greater system that had taken control of my truck and was steering me toward an unknown destination. Not physically controlling the steering wheel or the throttle, but influencing my decisions, making certain choices feel natural while others felt impossible. I tried to fight it, to assert my independence by pulling over at the next available spot. But my hand refused to move the turn signal. My foot wouldn't lift from the accelerator. Not through any physical restraint, but through a deep certainty that stopping would be the wrong choice, that whatever was happening needed to reach its conclusion. The pulsing beneath my foot had become a countdown, marking off moments until some predetermined arrival. The rain began to ease, and through the clearing windshield, I saw lights in the distance. Not the harsh fluorescent glare of a truck stop, or the scattered yellow dots of a small town, but something softer and more diffuse, like aurora borealis reflected off low clouds. The lights pulsed in rhythm with everything else, 60 beats per minute, and I knew with absolute certainty that this was my destination. As I drew closer, the lights resolved into something that defied easy description. They seemed to emanate from the road itself, or perhaps from just beneath its surface, creating patterns that shifted and flowed like living things, The asphalt ahead glowed with a pearl-like luminescence that extended as far as I could see, transforming the highway into a river of light flowing through the darkness. My truck rolled onto this luminous surface without any change in traction or handling, but the pulsing beneath my foot intensified, becoming so strong that it traveled up through my leg and into my core. The engine's harmonic drone reached a crescendo that I felt rather than heard, a subsonic vibration that seemed to align every molecule in my body with the same mysterious rhythm that had been building throughout the night. The Color of Midnight from Marcus. The rain started normal enough that Thursday night just past 11 when I was hauling a load of electronics through eastern Oregon. I'd been driving these mountain highways for the better part of 15 years, and I knew every curve, every grade, every truck stop between Portland and Boise like the back of my weathered hands. My Kenworth hummed its familiar diesel lullaby as the windshield wipers swept back and forth in their eternal rhythm, clearing away the droplets that caught the glow of my headlights like scattered diamonds against the black asphalt ahead. The CB radio crackled occasionally with distant trucker chatter, mostly complaints about the weather rolling in from the Pacific. Nothing unusual there. October in the Cascades meant rain and lots of it. I'd adjusted my schedule accordingly, knowing the slick roads would slow me down, but I had plenty of time to make my delivery in Boise before dawn broke over the valley. The heater hummed quietly, keeping the cab warm while outside the temperature dropped into the 40s, and I sipped lukewarm coffee from my thermos as mile marker after mile marker disappeared in my rearview mirror. It was somewhere around midnight, maybe 20 miles past the last town I could remember the name of, when I first noticed something wasn't quite right about the rain. At first I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me after so many hours on the road. The droplets hitting my windshield looked darker somehow, not the usual clear water I was accustomed to seeing. I blinked hard a few times, rubbed my eyes with the back of my hand, and looked again. The wipers swept across the glass, leaving behind streaks that seemed almost gray in the glow of my dashboard lights. I reached for the CB handset, thinking maybe I'd check in with any other drivers in the area, see if they were experiencing anything similar. But all I got was static when I keyed the mic. Dead air. Not even the usual background chatter you'd expect on a busy freight corridor like this one. I tried adjusting the squelch, cycling through different channels, but nothing came through except that low, persistent hiss of empty airwaves. That should have been my first real warning that something was seriously wrong. But fatigue has a way of dulling your instincts, making you rationalize things that don't make sense. The rain began coming down harder, and with it the darkness of the water became more pronounced. What had started as a subtle gray tint was now unmistakably black, like liquid coal streaming down from the night sky. My wipers struggled to clear it away, leaving dark smears across the windshield that made it increasingly difficult to see the road ahead. I slowed down, switching on my four-ways, and pulled over at the next wide spot in the highway to get a better look at what was happening. I stepped out of the cab, pulling my jacket hood up against the downpour, and immediately felt the difference. This wasn't normal rainwater hitting my skin. It was thick, almost oily in texture, and it left dark stains on my hands and jacket that didn't wash away when I wiped at them. The smell was wrong too, metallic and sharp, like the taste of old pennies or the scent that hangs in the air after lightning strikes close by. I stood there for a moment, watching this black rain cascade off my truck's hood and pool in the chrome of my bumpers, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. Back in the cab, I tried the radio again, scanning through every channel, desperate for any kind of contact with the outside world. Finally, on channel 19, I caught a faint transmission, barely audible through the static. Another trucker's voice, strained and worried, saying something about black rain and roads closing ahead. But the signal faded before I could make out any details. I grabbed my cell phone, but there were no bars, no signal at all, which was unusual for this stretch of highway where I'd always had decent coverage before. The engine idled quietly as I sat there trying to decide what to do. I could turn around, head back the way I'd come, but my delivery schedule was already tight, and explaining to my dispatcher why I'd turned tail because of some weird rain wouldn't go over well. Besides, it was probably just some kind of atmospheric anomaly, maybe ash from a distant forest fire mixing with the precipitation, or pollution from some industrial accident carried on the wind. There had to be a logical explanation for what I was seeing. I put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, driving slowly through the increasingly heavy downpour. The black rain drummed against my roof with a sound different from normal water, heavier somehow, more solid, like hail made of liquid shadow. My headlights seemed dimmer, absorbed by the dark precipitation, and I had to lean forward in my seat to make out the yellow lines marking the center of the road. The familiar landscape of pine trees and rocky outcroppings had become alien and threatening, transformed by this strange weather into something from a fever dream. That's when I saw the first abandoned vehicle. A sedan sitting sideways across both lanes, its doors hanging open like broken wings, its paint streaked with the same dark substance that was coating everything else. There was no sign of the driver or any passengers, just an empty car sitting in the middle of the highway as if its occupants had simply vanished into the night. I managed to squeeze my rig around it using the shoulder, but the sight of it sent ice through my veins. People don't just abandon their cars in the middle of nowhere, not without a very good reason. A few miles further on, I encountered another vehicle, this one a pickup truck overturned in the ditch beside the road. Its undercarriage was completely black, as if it had been dipped in tar, and the windows were so dark I couldn't see inside even when I shone my flashlight through the passenger compartment. The beam seemed to be absorbed by whatever coating covered the glass, swallowed up like light disappearing into a black hole. I called out, asking if anyone needed help, but my voice was muffled by the rain and no answer came back from the wreckage. The radio crackled to life again, just for a moment, and I heard what sounded like a weather service emergency broadcast, something about seeking immediate shelter and avoiding contact with precipitation in several counties. But the signal cut out before I could hear which counties they were talking about. My hands were shaking now as I gripped the steering wheel, and I realized that the black rain hitting my windshield was no longer sliding off like normal water. Instead, it was building up, accumulating in a way that defied physics, creating a dark film that my wipers couldn't completely clear away. I reached the crest of a long hill and looked down into the valley below, where I could see the lights of what should have been a small town, maybe a place where I could find shelter and wait out whatever this phenomenon was. But as I descended toward those lights, I realized they weren't the warm yellow glow of street lamps and neon signs I was expecting. They were cold and blue, pulsing in a rhythm that hurt my eyes to look at directly, and the buildings they illuminated seemed wrong somehow. Their shapes too angular, their shadows too deep. The black rain was falling even harder now, coming down in sheets that turned the world outside my windshield into an impenetrable wall of darkness. My engine started to sputter, and I realized that the strange precipitation was somehow affecting the truck's systems. The air intake was probably clogged with whatever this stuff was, and if I didn't find shelter soon, I'd be stranded out here with all the other abandoned vehicles I'd been passing with increasing frequency. That's when I saw the lights in my mirrors. Not headlights, but something else entirely. A soft phosphorescent glow that seemed to be following me down the mountain road. When I slowed down, the lights slowed down. When I sped up, they matched my pace exactly, staying the same distance behind me no matter what I did. They had a quality to them that reminded me of deep ocean creatures, bioluminescent fish that lived in trenches where sunlight never reached, and watching them in my mirrors made my skin crawl with primitive fear. The town, when I finally reached it, was completely empty. Every building was coated in that same black substance that had been falling from the sky, and the streets were ankle-deep in what looked like liquid obsidian. The blue lights I'd seen from the hill were coming from inside some of the structures, but I couldn't tell what was generating them, and I had no intention of stopping to find out. Whatever had happened here, whatever the black rain had done to this place and its people, I wanted no part of it. I gunned the engine, pushing my truck as hard as I dared through the flooded streets, splashing through pools of the dark liquid that had collected in every low spot and intersection. The substance clung to my tires, my fenders, my fuel tanks, building up in layers that made the truck feel heavier and more sluggish with every mile. The sleeper that remembers from Marcus Chen, I've been running coast to coast for 15 years, and in all that time, I thought I knew every sound my Peterbilt could make. The deep rumble of the Caterpillar engine, the whistle of air brakes, the gentle hiss of the air conditioning cycling on and off through the night. But it wasn't until I took delivery of that 2019 model with the extended sleeper that I learned trucks can hold memories in ways I never imagined possible. The rig came to me through unusual circumstances. The previous owner, a driver named Eddie Kowalski, had simply walked away from it at a truck stop outside Amarillo, left the keys on the dashboard, his logbook open to a half-finished entry, and disappeared into the Texas night. The company needed someone to take over the lease, and the money was too good to pass up. Eddie had been meticulous about maintenance, and the truck ran like a dream. During the day, anyway. It was my third night with the rig when I first heard it. I'd parked at a rest area off Interstate 80, somewhere in the empty stretch between Salt Lake City and Reno. The kind of place where the only light comes from a few buzzing fluorescents over picnic tables that nobody uses, and the wind carries the scent of sage and something older, something that speaks to the part of your brain that still remembers when humans were prey. I'd finished my mandatory 10-hour break and was preparing to roll out when I realized I'd left my thermos in the sleeper. As I climbed back into the cab, I heard it for the first time. A soft rattling, almost rhythmic, coming from somewhere behind the driver's seat. Not the mechanical rattle of loose bolts or worn suspension, but something more organic, like bones in a bag or maybe dice being rolled by invisible hands. I stood there for a moment, listening, trying to place the sound among all the normal noises a truck makes when it's settling for the night. The rattling stopped the moment I stepped fully into the sleeper compartment. I told myself it was probably just the refrigerator cycling, or maybe something in one of the storage compartments that Eddie had left behind. These extended sleepers have dozens of little cubbyholes and storage spaces, and the previous owner might have forgotten something that was rolling around loose. I made a mental note to check it out at my next stop and climbed back into the driver's seat. The next few days passed without incident. I made good time through Nevada and California, delivered my load of agricultural equipment to a depot outside Bakersfield, and picked up a return load of almonds bound for a processing plant in Georgia. It was steady, profitable work, and I was beginning to appreciate the extra comfort of the extended sleeper. Eddie had outfitted it well, with a high-quality mattress, blackout curtains, and even a small flat-screen TV mounted on the wall. It was during my mandatory rest period at a truck stop outside Flagstaff that I heard the rattling again. This time I was lying in the sleeper bunk, trying to catch a few hours of sleep before the next leg of the journey. The sound started soft, almost like rain on the roof, but gradually grew more distinct. Rattle, pause, with an irregular rhythm that seemed almost like Morse code. I switched on the LED reading light and looked around the sleeper compartment. Everything appeared normal. My clothes hung neatly in the small closet. My cooler hummed quietly in its designated space, and my laptop sat closed on the fold-down desk. But the rattling continued, seeming to come from the walls themselves. This time, when I sat up in the bunk, the sound didn't stop immediately. For perhaps 10 seconds it continued, and in that brief window I could swear I heard something else underneath it. A whisper so faint it might have been the wind, but wind doesn't usually sound like it's trying to tell you something important. Wind doesn't usually sound afraid. I spent the next hour going through every storage compartment I could find, looking for whatever Eddie had left behind that might be causing the noise. I found a few personal items he'd overlooked. A worn paperback novel, a phone charger for a model that was at least 5 years out of date, and a small digital camera with a cracked screen. But nothing that could account for the rattling, and certainly nothing that could explain the whispers. The camera wouldn't turn on, but I slipped it into my own gear bag anyway. Maybe Eddie would want it back if I ever tracked him down. Over the next several weeks, the rattling became a regular occurrence, but only when I was alone in the sleeper compartment during my rest periods. Never during the day, never when I was driving, and never when I had company. I'd started picking up hitchhikers occasionally, something I'd rarely done in my earlier years of driving, but somehow their presence seemed to keep whatever was causing the noise at bay. The whispers, when they came, were always too faint to make out clearly. Sometimes they seemed urgent, other times mournful, but they never lasted long enough for me to record them on my phone or make sense of what they might be trying to communicate. I began to wonder if Eddie had experienced the same thing, and if that's why he'd abandoned the truck so suddenly. It was during a layover in Oklahoma City that I finally got the camera working. A teenager at a truck stop electronics counter managed to jury-rig a power adapter for it, and after charging for a few hours, the cracked screen flickered to life. Most of the photos were exactly what you'd expect from a trucker's camera. Scenic highway shots, pictures of interesting loads, snapshots of truck stop food that probably seemed funnier after 18 hours on the road than they did in retrospect. But the final dozen photos were different. They were all taken inside the sleeper compartment, and they all showed the same thing. Eddie lying in the bunk, apparently asleep, but his face in each photo showed an expression of profound unease, as if his dreams were anything but restful. In the last few images, his mouth was open as if he were speaking, or perhaps screaming silently. What made the photos truly unsettling, though, was that they were all taken from the same angle, as if the camera had been mounted on the wall opposite the bunk. But I'd searched every inch of that wall and found no mounting brackets, no screw holes, nothing to indicate where a camera might have been positioned. It was as if the photos had been taken by someone standing in a space that simply didn't exist. That night, parked at a rest area along Interstate 40, the rattling started earlier than usual, beginning just as the sun disappeared behind the distant mesas. I was sitting at the fold-down desk updating my logbook when the sound began somewhere behind me. This time, instead of trying to locate its source, I just sat quietly and listened. The rhythm was definitely not random. 3 short rattles, 3 long ones, 3 short ones again, SOS. Then a pause, followed by a longer sequence that I tried to transcribe in the margin of my logbook. Rattle, rattle, pause, rattle, 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 pause, rattle. If it was Morse code, and if I was transcribing it correctly, it was spelling out something that made my hands shake as I wrote it down. ELPME, the whispers that followed were clearer than they'd ever been before, and for the first time I could make out actual words. "Can't wake up," the voice said, thin and desperate. "Can't wake up, can't wake up, can't wake up." I recognized the voice from a phone call I'd made to Eddie's emergency contact, trying to return some of the personal items I'd found. His sister had played me a voicemail Eddie had left her, just to confirm that the stuff was really his. The voice in the sleeper was older, more strained, but unmistakably the same. "Eddie?" I whispered into the darkness of the sleeper compartment. The rattling stopped immediately, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. Then, in a voice that sounded like it was coming from very far away, I heard him say, "You can hear me." What followed was a conversation that lasted most of the night, though calling it a conversation might be generous. Eddie's voice came and went like a radio signal from a distant station, sometimes clear enough that I could make out every word, sometimes fading to nothing more than whispers and static. But piece by piece I managed to understand what had happened to him. He'd been having trouble sleeping in the new truck, he told me. The sleeper was comfortable enough, but every time he'd start to drift off, he'd hear sounds that would jolt him awake. Rattling, scratching, whispers he couldn't quite make out. He'd started taking over-the-counter sleep aids, then prescription ones, trying to get the rest he needed to drive safely. The highway of broken voices from Marcus. The first time I heard glass screaming beneath my tires, I thought it was just another hazard of night driving on Highway 49. 23 years behind the wheel of my Peterbilt. hauling everything from lumber to electronics across the Pacific Northwest. And you learn to expect the unexpected. Broken bottles, shattered headlights, the occasional windshield scattered like deadly confetti across the asphalt. But this was different. This glass sang back to me. It started 3 weeks ago on a run from Portland to Spokane. My trailer loaded with computer components that made the whole rig worth more than most people's houses. The October rain had been falling steady for hours, turning the world beyond my windshield into a watercolor painting of blurred lights and shadow. My wipers beat their familiar rhythm, a metronome keeping time with the diesel's steady rumble beneath my feet. The radio crackled with distant voices, other drivers sharing road conditions and weather updates across the static-filled airwaves. I'd been driving this route for over a decade, knew every curve and grade by heart. The stretch of 49 between milepost 127 and 134 had always been trouble. Something about the way the road cut through those pine-covered hills. How the fog rolled in thick as cotton and hung there like it had business to attend to. The state crews were always out there sweeping up debris, but they never seemed to get it all. Glass collected in the shoulders and sometimes spread across the lanes like someone had been breaking bottles for sport. That night, pushing through a particularly thick bank of fog around milepost 130, I felt the familiar crunch beneath my drive tires. Nothing unusual in that except for the sound it made. Not the typical grinding pop of glass being crushed, but something else entirely. Something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel and my foot ease off the throttle just a fraction. It sounded like voices, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all crying out at once in a pitch so high it seemed to bypass my ears and go straight into my bones. The sound rose and fell with each revolution of my tires, creating a symphony of anguish that followed me for nearly a quarter mile, before fading back to the normal highway noise I'd grown accustomed to over the years. I reached for my CB radio, thumb hovering over the talk button, ready to ask if anyone else had heard what I'd just experienced, but something held me back. The night felt too quiet suddenly, too empty, like the fog had swallowed up not just the landscape but all the other drivers who should have been sharing this stretch of road with me. My radio remained silent except for the soft hiss of static. No chatter from other truckers. No distant music bleeding over from the AM stations. The next week brought another run through the same area, this time carrying a load of furniture bound for Coeur d'Alene. I found myself approaching milepost 130 with a mixture of dread and curiosity, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. The weather was clearer, just a light drizzle speckling my windshield, but the fog still clung to the hillsides like it was painted there. Sure enough, the glass was waiting for me. This time I was ready for the sound, or thought I was. The screaming started the moment my tires made contact, but now I could hear something else beneath the surface. Words. Actual words floating up from the road, fragmented and distorted but unmistakably human speech. Pleas for help. Cries of confusion and fear, names being called out in voices raw with desperation. I slowed my rig to barely 30 miles per hour, earning angry honks from the few cars that managed to pass me in the murky conditions. But I needed to hear more, needed to understand what was happening on this stretch of highway that had become something far stranger than a simple debris field. The voices grew clearer as my speed decreased. I could make out individual speakers now, men and women of various ages, all seeming to speak at once but somehow never quite drowning each other out. They spoke of bright lights and sudden impact, of metal and glass and the terrible moment when they realized they weren't going home. Most chilling of all was how they seemed to be discovering their situation anew each time, as if experiencing their final moments over and over again. That's when I started to understand. This wasn't just broken glass scattered across the highway. These were the remnants of accidents, of lives that had ended violently on this particular stretch of road. And somehow, impossibly, something of those people remained trapped in the very fragments that had once been their windshields, their windows, their final view of the world. I began researching the history of Highway 49, spending my mandatory rest periods in truck stops with free Wi-Fi, scrolling through accident reports and newspaper archives. What I found made my blood run cold. Over the past 15 years, there had been 47 fatal accidents on that 7-mile stretch between mileposts 127 and 134. Fog-related crashes mostly, but also mechanical failures, medical emergencies, and a few that remained unexplained. 47 separate incidents that had claimed 81 lives total. The state had tried everything to improve safety on that section. Better lighting, reflective barriers, warning signs every quarter mile. Nothing seemed to help. If anything, the accident rate had increased over the past few years. The official reports blamed driver fatigue and weather conditions, but reading between the lines, I could sense the investigators' frustration. There was something about that stretch of road that defied easy explanation. My next trip through took place during a thunderstorm that made visibility nearly zero. I was carrying a time-sensitive load of medical supplies, couldn't afford to pull over and wait out the weather like my common sense was screaming at me to do. The rain hammered my windshield so hard that even with the wipers on their highest setting, I was essentially driving blind. Approaching the now familiar area around milepost 130, I found myself holding my breath. The storm had washed most of the usual debris from the road, and I thought I might pass through without incident. But then my headlights caught something that made me step hard on the brakes, bringing 40 tons of truck and trailer to a shuddering stop in the middle of the highway. The entire road surface gleamed like a mirror, covered in a layer of glass so thick and uniform it looked intentional. Not scattered fragments this time, but what appeared to be sheets of the stuff, perfectly smooth and reflecting my headlights back at me in brilliant, blinding flashes. It stretched from shoulder to shoulder and disappeared into the darkness ahead, a river of glass that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. I sat there for nearly 10 minutes, engine idling, trying to figure out what I was seeing. No way could this much glass have come from normal accidents or road debris. It looked like someone had intentionally covered the highway with mirrors, creating a surface that would be impossible to drive on safely. But I could see tire tracks leading into it, fresh marks from vehicles that had passed this way recently. Taking a deep breath, I eased off the brakes and let the truck roll forward at barely walking speed. The moment my tires made contact with the glass, the screaming began. But this time, it wasn't just voices crying out in anguish. This time they were trying to warn me. "Turn back," they pleaded in chorus. "Don't join us here. Please, while you still can, turn around and go back." The glass beneath my wheels began to crack and splinter, each fracture releasing more voices, more desperate pleas for me to save myself. But there was nowhere to turn around. No way to reverse a fully loaded tractor trailer on a narrow mountain highway. I had no choice but to continue forward, following the path that so many others had taken before me. As I drove deeper into the forest of voices, I began to see shapes moving beneath the glass, shadowy figures that seemed to be pressing upward from below, their faces distorted but clearly human, mouths open in silent screams that found voice only when my tires passed directly overhead. They reached toward me with translucent hands, not grasping but gesturing, pointing ahead to something I couldn't yet see. The road began to curve, a gentle bend that I'd navigated hundreds of times before, but now lit by the supernatural glow emanating from the glass beneath me, I could see that the curve was wrong, too sharp, too sudden, leading not around the hill as it should, but directly into a wall of solid rock that hadn't been there before. Or perhaps it had always been there, and the road I'd been driving all these years was nothing but a collective memory, a ghost highway that existed only in the minds of those who had died trying to navigate it. I yanked the wheel hard left, feeling the trailer begin to slide on the impossible surface. My tires found purchase on something more substantial than glass, regular asphalt that felt solid and real beneath the weight of my rig. The mirror's memory from Jake Sullivan. The rain started just past midnight somewhere between Flagstaff and Albuquerque, drumming against my windshield in that steady rhythm that makes the miles blur together. I'd been driving this route for 12 years, hauling electronics from Phoenix to Denver, and I knew every truck stop, every scenic overlook, every pothole that could rattle your teeth loose. My Peterbilt 379 was getting on in years, but she still purred like a contented cat when I kept her at a steady 75. The CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter from other night drivers, their voices floating through the static like ghosts haunting the airwaves. It was during one of those long, hypnotic stretches of highway that I first noticed something odd about my rearview mirror. I'd been adjusting it to check on a car that had been following a bit too close, and as the headlights fell back into a more comfortable distance, I caught sight of something that made me do a double take. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw the same blue sedan that had passed me about 20 minutes earlier. The one with the cracked windshield and the driver who'd given me a friendly wave. But that was impossible. I'd watched that car disappear around a bend miles back. I shook my head and attributed it to road fatigue, that peculiar exhaustion that comes from staring at endless asphalt under the glow of dashboard lights. The coffee I'd picked up at the last truck stop had gone cold hours ago, leaving that bitter aftertaste that seems to coat your mouth when you're pushing through the small hours of the morning. Outside, the landscape rolled by in shadowy waves, painted silver by moonlight filtering through the cloud cover. The steady hum of my engine mixed with the whisper of tires on wet pavement, creating a lullaby that threatened to make my eyelids heavy. But sleep was the last thing on my mind when I glanced in the rearview mirror again and saw the same impossible sight. The blue sedan was there once more, following at exactly the same distance with that distinctive crack running across its windshield like a spider's web. This time I was wide awake and paying attention, and I knew with absolute certainty that this car had passed me and disappeared into the night. The driver's silhouette was exactly as I remembered it. A thin figure hunched slightly forward, hands positioned at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel with mechanical precision. My heart began to beat a little faster as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe there were two similar cars on the road tonight, I told myself, though even as the thought formed, I knew it was a desperate attempt to explain away something that defied explanation. The crack in the windshield was too distinctive, running in that same jagged pattern from the lower left corner up toward the center. I'd noticed it specifically because it reminded me of the lightning bolt scar from those wizard movies my daughter used to love. I decided to test my growing suspicion by changing lanes and slowing down slightly, watching carefully as the sedan approached and eventually passed me. The driver gave that same friendly wave, and I got a better look at the windshield crack. Definitely the same pattern. I made a mental note of the license plate, though the rain and darkness made it difficult to read clearly. Then I watched in my side mirrors as the sedan's taillights grew smaller and eventually disappeared around a curve about 3 miles ahead. For the next 15 minutes, I kept my eyes glued to the road ahead, certain that I would eventually catch up to the sedan or at least see its taillights in the distance. But the highway remained empty, except for the occasional 18-wheeler heading in the opposite direction, their headlights briefly illuminating the rain-slicked asphalt before fading into the darkness behind me. It was as if the blue sedan had simply vanished into thin air, dissolved by the night and the rain like sugar in black coffee. That's when I made the mistake of checking my rearview mirror again. There it was, following at the exact same distance as before, that spiderweb crack clearly visible across the windshield. The driver's posture was identical, hands at 10 and 2, shoulders hunched forward in concentration. It was like looking at a photograph that had been copied and reprinted, every detail precisely the same. The impossibility of it sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air seeping through my cab's weather stripping. I tried the CB radio, switching to channel 19 where most of the truckers monitored. Breaker 19, this is Nighthawk eastbound on I-40 near mile marker 215. Anyone else seeing anything strange out here tonight? Static answered me, punctuated by the distant echo of someone's conversation too faint to understand. I tried again, but the radio seemed to be working fine. It was just that nobody was responding, as if I were completely alone on this stretch of highway. The pattern continued with unsettling regularity. Every 20 minutes or so, the blue sedan would appear in my rearview mirror, follow for a while, then pass me with that same friendly wave before disappearing into the darkness ahead. I started timing it with my dashboard clock, and the intervals were precise to the minute, 23 minutes each time. It was like watching the same scene play out over and over again, a loop of highway theater that made no logical sense. By the fourth repetition, my hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had gone white. The familiar comfort of my cab, the worn leather seat molded to my body over years of long hauls, the family photos tucked into the visor, the small St. Christopher statue my wife had given me for luck, all of it felt suddenly foreign and insubstantial. The rain continued its steady percussion against the windshield, and my wipers swept back and forth in their hypnotic rhythm. But now every familiar sound seemed amplified and strange. I decided to break the pattern by pulling over at the next rest stop, a small facility that consisted of little more than a few parking spaces, some picnic tables and restrooms that were usually locked this time of night. As I guided my rig into the parking area, I watched my mirrors carefully, but the blue sedan didn't follow. Instead, it continued past the rest stop without even slowing down, the driver's wave visible in my peripheral vision. Finally, I thought, the loop was broken. I sat in my cab with the engine idling, listening to the rain drumming on the roof and trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. Maybe I'd been more tired than I'd realized. Maybe the repetitive nature of highway driving had played tricks on my mind, creating false memories or causing me to misidentify different vehicles. The rational explanations felt thin and unconvincing, but they were all I had to hold on to in a situation that seemed to exist outside the boundaries of normal experience. After about 10 minutes, I pulled back onto the highway, determined to put the strange episode behind me and focus on reaching Denver before the morning rush hour made the final stretch through the city, a nightmare of stop-and-go traffic. The rain was beginning to lighten, and patches of clear sky showed stars between the breaking clouds. For a while, everything seemed normal. Just me, my truck, and the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching toward the horizon. Then I checked my rearview mirror and felt my blood turn to ice water in my veins. The blue sedan was there again, following at that same precise distance, but now I could see something that hadn't been visible before. In the brief moments when our vehicle's positions allowed the headlights to illuminate the sedan's interior, I could see that the driver wasn't alone. There was a passenger in the front seat and another figure in the back. But these weren't new passengers who had joined the mysterious driver. They were me. I could see myself in the passenger seat, wearing the same red flannel shirt I had on. I face-turned toward the window with an expression of confusion and fear that mirrored exactly what I was feeling at that moment. In the back seat sat another version of me, this one leaning forward between the seats as if trying to get a better look at something up ahead. All three versions of myself moved with perfect synchronization, like reflections in a funhouse mirror that had somehow gained independent existence. The sedan began to pull alongside my truck, and I found myself staring directly into my own eyes in the passenger seat. The other me mouthed words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. "You're stuck in the loop now." The driver, also me, I realized with growing horror, gave that same friendly wave I'd seen so many times before. But now the gesture seemed mocking, almost cruel. Then the sedan accelerated past my truck and disappeared into the night ahead, leaving me alone with the rain and the terrible understanding that I was trapped in something far worse than highway hypnosis. I never did make it to Denver that morning, though according to my logbook and GPS system, I should have arrived hours ago. Instead, I find myself driving the same stretch of highway over and over, watching for that blue sedan in my rearview mirror and knowing that each time it appears. The paper trail from Marcus. The thing about long-haul trucking is that you meet all kinds of people on the road, and most of them you forget within a day or two. The face blurs, the conversation fades, and they become just another mile marker in your memory. But some passengers leave more than just an impression. They leave reminders. I've been driving the same route between Portland and Salt Lake City for nearly 15 years now, piloting my cherry red Peterbilt through mountain passes and desert flats, watching the landscape change with the seasons like pages in a well-worn book. The cab of my truck has become more familiar to me than my own apartment, with its worn leather seat molded to my body and the gentle vibration of the diesel engine that lulls me into a meditative state during those endless stretches of asphalt. It was a Tuesday night in late October when I first picked up the hitchhiker near the Oregon-Idaho border. The rain had been falling steadily for hours, turning the world outside my windshield into a watercolor painting of blurred lights and shadows. My wipers swept back and forth in their hypnotic rhythm, and the heater hummed softly, keeping the autumn chill at bay. The radio crackled with distant conversations between other drivers, their voices fading in and out like ghosts in the static. That's when I saw her, standing beneath the flickering neon of a long-abandoned gas station, her thumb extended toward the highway. She was young, maybe early 20s, with dark hair plastered to her head from the rain. Her clothes were soaked through and she shivered visibly in the pale light. Something about her reminded me of my own daughter. And before I could think twice about company policy or personal safety, I was pulling my rig to the shoulder. She climbed into the passenger seat with a grateful smile, bringing with her the scent of rain and something else, something sweet and floral like jasmine or honeysuckle. Her name was Sarah, she told me, and she was trying to get to Twin Falls to see her sister. She spoke softly, almost whisper quiet, and I found myself leaning forward slightly to catch her words over the rumble of the engine. The conversation flowed easily as we rolled through the night. She asked about life on the road, about the places I'd seen and the people I'd met. I told her about sunrises over the Rockies that could make a grown man weep, about truck stops that served coffee strong enough to wake the dead, about the strange sense of freedom that comes from carrying your world with you wherever you go. She listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and laughing at my stories in all the right places. When we reached Twin Falls around 3 a.m, she thanked me warmly and gathered her small backpack. As she stepped down from the cab, she paused and looked back at me with those dark eyes that seemed to hold depths I couldn't fathom. "You're a good man, Marcus," she said, though I couldn't remember telling her my name. "Thank you for the kindness." I watched her walk away into the pre-dawn darkness, her figure growing smaller until the shadows swallowed her completely. Then I started up the engine and continued on my route, already half forgetting the encounter as the miles rolled beneath my wheels. It wasn't until the next morning, when I stopped for fuel outside Salt Lake City, that I found the note. It was tucked into the sun visor on the passenger side, written in delicate handwriting on a piece of paper that looked old, yellowed at the edges like parchment. The words were simple: "Thank you for seeing me. Not everyone does." Says I stared at the note for a long moment, feeling a strange chill despite the warming sun. Something about those words unsettled me, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. I folded the paper and slipped it into my shirt pocket, telling myself it was just an unusual way of saying thanks. 2 weeks later, I was making the same run when I saw her again. Same spot, same flickering neon, same rain-soaked figure with her thumb extended toward the passing traffic. This time I noticed she was wearing exactly the same clothes, down to the scuffed boots and faded denim jacket. When she climbed into the cab, she seemed surprised to see me, as if she'd never laid eyes on me before in her life. "I'm Sarah," she said, extending a damp hand. "Thank you so much for stopping." I played along, uncertain whether she was confused or playing some kind of game. But as the night wore on and we covered the same ground with the same conversations, word for word in some cases, an uncomfortable recognition began to settle in my chest. She asked about life on the road, laughed at the same stories, made the same observations about the passing landscape. When we reached Twin Falls, she thanked me with the same words, called me a good man, and vanished into the same shadows. The next morning I found another note, this one tucked behind the CB radio. The road gets lonely. I hope I helped. As a pattern emerged over the following months. Every other week, sometimes every third week, I would encounter Sarah at that same abandoned gas station. Rain or shine, day or night, she would be there, thumb extended, wearing those same rain-soaked clothes. Each time she acted as if we'd never met, went through the same routine of gratitude and conversation, and left behind another note in an increasingly creative hiding spot. I began to look forward to our encounters, even as they filled me with a growing sense of unease. There was something comforting about the predictability of her presence, the familiar rhythm of our conversations. But there was also something deeply wrong with the whole situation, something that made my skin crawl even as I found myself pulling over again and again. The notes began to change, becoming more personal, more unsettling. "You have kind eyes like my father did," read one, found tucked inside my logbook. "I can tell you've lost people too," said another, discovered in my coffee cup holder. "Some passengers never really leave," declared a third, which I found rubber banded to my steering wheel. I started researching the area around that gas station, digging through old news articles and police reports. What I found made my blood run cold. Sarah Mitchell, age 22, had been reported missing 3 years earlier. She was last seen hitchhiking near the Oregon-Idaho border, trying to reach her sister in Twin Falls. Her car had broken down during a rainstorm, and she'd apparently decided to walk to the nearby gas station for help. Her body was found 2 weeks later in a ravine about a mile from the highway, apparently the victim of exposure and a fall in the darkness. The photograph in the missing person report showed the same face I'd been seeing in my passenger seat for months, down to the smallest detail. The same dark eyes, the same gentle smile, the same rain-soaked hair. According to the coroner's report, Sarah Mitchell had been dead for over 2 years before I first picked her up. I should have stopped driving that route. I should have requested a transfer, found a different job, done anything to avoid that stretch of highway and the impossible passenger who waited there. But something kept drawing me back. Some combination of morbid curiosity and genuine affection for the quiet young woman who thanked me so earnestly for my kindness. The notes became more frequent, appearing in places I was certain I'd checked before. They showed up in my glove compartment, taped to the inside of my thermos, folded into the pages of my atlas. The handwriting remained the same delicate script, but the messages grew increasingly strange and personal. "You remind me of home," read one. "I wish I could have made it to my sister's house," said another. "The rain was so cold that night," confessed a third. Each note felt like a small confession, a glimpse into thoughts and feelings that should have died with her body in that ravine. Then, on a particularly dark November night, something changed. I picked up Sarah as usual, went through the familiar ritual of conversation and company. But when we reached Twin Falls, she didn't get out. She sat quietly in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead through the windshield at the empty street. "This is your stop," I said gently, my heart beginning to race. "Is it?" she asked, turning to look at me with those dark eyes that now seemed older, sadder, filled with a knowledge I didn't want to understand. "I've been riding with drivers like you for 3 years now, Marcus. Leaving notes, trying to make some kind of connection, some kind of meaning out of what happened to me." The temperature in the cab seemed to drop 20 degrees. I could see my breath misting in the air, and the windows began to fog over despite the heater running full blast. "You're not really here," I whispered, the words scraping past my dry throat. "I'm here enough," she replied. "The loop at mile marker 187 from Wesley. I've been hauling freight across the continental United States for the better part of 15 years now, and I thought I'd seen every trick the road could pull on a man. Dead ends that appear out of nowhere, on your GPS, construction zones that seem to stretch into infinity, and those peculiar small towns that feel like they exist in a different decade altogether. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened on Interstate 40 last October, somewhere between Flagstaff and Albuquerque. The evening had started routinely enough. My Peterbilt 379 was loaded with computer components bound for a distribution center in Oklahoma City, and I was making good time despite the light drizzle that had been following me since I crossed into New Mexico. The wipers maintained their steady rhythm against the windshield, creating a hypnotic percussion that mixed with the low rumble of the Caterpillar engine beneath the hood. The radio crackled occasionally with chatter from other drivers, their voices distant and tinny through the static. It was approaching midnight when I first noticed the exit sign. Mile marker 187, it read, with an arrow pointing toward what appeared to be a standard off-ramp. Nothing unusual about it initially, just another numbered exit in the endless procession of highway infrastructure, but something about the lighting caught my attention. While most of the other signs I'd passed were illuminated by standard highway lighting, this one seemed to glow with an oddly warm, almost amber quality that made the reflective letters appear to pulse gently in the darkness. My fuel gauge showed I had plenty of diesel to reach the next major truck stop, and my logbook indicated I still had 2 hours left on my driving time, so there was no practical reason to take the exit. Yet as I approached, I found myself inexplicably drawn to it. Perhaps it was the monotony of the long, straight stretch of highway, or maybe just curiosity about where such an isolated exit might lead, but I felt my hands turning the steering wheel almost of their own accord. The off-ramp curved gently to the right, descending into what appeared to be a shallow valley. The asphalt was perfectly smooth, recently paved it seemed, with fresh yellow lines that gleamed like wet paint in my headlights. As I downshifted and let the engine brake slow the rig, I noticed that the usual roadside vegetation had given way to something different. Instead of the scrub brush and desert plants I'd grown accustomed to, tall grass swayed on both sides of the road, though I couldn't feel any wind through the cab. The exit led to what looked like a standard rural highway, 2 lanes with a faded center line. A small green sign indicated this was Route 187, though I couldn't recall seeing any mention of such a route on my atlas. The rain had stopped completely now, but the air outside seemed thick with moisture, creating a fine mist that swirled in, the beam of my headlights like tiny spirits dancing in the night. I drove for what felt like 20 minutes along this strange highway, expecting to encounter some indication of civilization, or at least another road sign that might tell me where I was heading. The landscape remained eerily uniform on both sides, just those tall grasses bending and swaying in patterns that seemed almost choreographed. My CB radio had gone completely silent, not even the usual background static that typically accompanies long-distance trucking at night. Then I saw it ahead, another highway sign growing larger in my windshield. My heart began to beat a little, faster as I read the familiar words. Interstate 40 with an arrow pointing toward an on-ramp. This struck me as odd since I couldn't have traveled more than a few miles from where I'd exited, yet here was an entrance back to the very highway I'd left. Perhaps, I reasoned, this was simply one of those short rural routes that provided access to isolated communities before reconnecting to the main thoroughfare. I guided the Peterbilt up the on-ramp, feeling a sense of relief as the familiar width and surface of Interstate 40 spread out before me. The highway lighting resumed its normal harsh white glow, and the desert vegetation returned to its expected sparse and scrubby appearance. I checked my odometer and was surprised to see that I'd apparently traveled less than 3 miles during my detour, though it had felt like much more. Settling back into the rhythm of long-distance driving, I reached for my thermos of coffee and took a long sip. The radio crackled back to life with the usual mix of weather reports and driver chatter. Everything seemed perfectly normal until I glanced at the upcoming mile markers and felt a chill run down my spine, despite the warmth of the cab. There, approaching on the right side of the highway, was mile marker 187, the same mile marker I'd passed when I first noticed the exit. But that was impossible. I had driven forward the entire time, never turning around, never doubling back. Yet here was the same marker, and there, just ahead, was the same exit sign with its strangely warm amber glow. I pressed harder on the accelerator, determined to pass the exit and continue on my route. But as I drew closer, I felt that same inexplicable pull, that curious magnetism that had drawn me off the highway in the first place. My hands seemed to develop a will of their own once again, and despite my conscious effort to maintain course, I found the steering wheel turning right, guiding the truck down the familiar off-ramp. The second trip down that route felt exactly like the first. The same smooth asphalt, the same swaying grass, the same thick mist that danced in my headlights. But this time, I paid closer attention to details, trying to understand what was happening. I checked my watch repeatedly, noting that time seemed to move normally. I tried the CB radio but received only silence. Most unsettling of all, I began to notice that the patterns in the swaying grass were indeed identical to what I'd observed during my first trip, as if I were watching a recording being played back. When I reached the on-ramp back to Interstate 40, I made a conscious decision to document what was happening. I pulled out my logbook and noted the exact time, odometer reading, and fuel level. According to my instruments, it was 12:47 a.m. I had traveled 847 miles since my last fuel stop, and my tank was 3/4 full. The third time I encountered mile marker 187, these numbers were exactly the same. By the fourth iteration, panic was beginning to set in. I tried everything I could think of to break the pattern. I attempted to stop the truck on Route 187, but the brakes seemed to respond sluggishly, as if the vehicle was reluctant to cease its forward motion. I tried to turn around at what appeared to be a wide spot in the road, but the steering became stiff and unresponsive whenever I attempted to deviate from the prescribed path. Most frightening of all, I experimented with simply staying on Interstate 40 when I reached mile marker 187, fighting against the strange compulsion to take the exit. But no matter how tightly I gripped the wheel or how firmly I pressed the accelerator, the truck would slow and turn onto that off-ramp as if controlled by some external force. It was during the 7th or 8th cycle that I began to notice subtle changes in my surroundings. The mist in the tall grass seemed to be growing thicker, and within it I started to perceive shapes that might have been tricks of the light but felt far too deliberate to be coincidental. Elongated shadows that moved independently of my headlights, forms that seemed to watch the truck pass with something resembling recognition, rather than mere animal curiosity. The sound of the engine, too, began to take on an unusual quality. While the rhythm remained steady, there was an underlying harmonic that I'd never noticed before, a deep resonance that seemed to synchronize with the swaying of the grass and the swirling of the mist. It was as if the entire loop had become a kind of machine, and my truck was just one component in its operation. On what I calculated to be the 10th time around, I noticed that my fuel gauge hadn't moved at all, despite the engine running continuously for what must have been hours. This should have been reassuring, but instead it filled me with a deeper dread. If the normal rules of physics and consumption didn't apply here, then what other assumptions about reality might prove false? It was during the 13th cycle that I saw the other headlights. They appeared in my rearview mirror just as I was completing the loop back onto Interstate 40. Another set of truck lights following the same impossible path I'd been trapped on. As we both approached mile marker 187, I watched in horror as the vehicle behind me, which appeared to be another long-haul rig similar to my own, dutifully took the exit just as I was compelled to do. But this time, something was different. As we both descended the off-ramp, I caught glimpses of the other truck in my mirrors, and I could see that it was maintaining exactly the same following distance, matching my speed perfectly despite my attempts to vary it. The harmony of the highway, from Marcus Reed. The thing about long-haul trucking is that after 23 years behind the wheel, you develop an appreciation for the small symphonies of the road. The rhythmic thrum of 18 wheels on asphalt, the gentle whoosh of passing traffic, the low diesel rumble that becomes as comforting as a heartbeat. But sometimes, just sometimes, the highway plays a tune that doesn't belong in any earthly orchestra. I was pulling a load of electronics from Phoenix to Denver on a Tuesday night in late October when I first heard them. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides of Interstate 40, painted silver under a full moon that hung like a watchful eye in the star-scattered sky. My Peterbilt 379 hummed contentedly as I maintained a steady 75. The CB crackling occasionally with the distant chatter of other drivers navigating the lonesome miles between Flagstaff and Gallup. The air was crisp with that particular desert chill that comes after sunset, and I had the windows cracked just enough to let in the clean, sage-scented breeze. My headlights carved twin tunnels through the darkness ahead, illuminating the endless ribbon of highway that seemed to lead straight into the heart of nowhere. This was the kind of night that made you grateful for the solitude, the kind of peaceful darkness that wrapped around your cab like an old blanket. It was just past midnight when I noticed the first set of headlights in my mirrors, distant but steady, maintaining the same speed as my rig. In this business, you learn to read the intentions of other drivers by how they position themselves on the road. This one seemed content to stay back about a quarter mile, close enough to be visible but far enough to avoid the courtesy of a passing wave. I figured it was another trucker, probably running the same route, happy to have some distant company on the empty highway. 20 minutes later, a second set of lights appeared behind the first, matching the same speed, maintaining the same respectful distance. Then a third. Within an hour, I counted 7 sets of headlights strung out behind me like luminous pearls on the dark thread of asphalt. Each truck maintained perfect spacing, perfect speed, as if they were all following some unspoken protocol of the road. The CB remained mysteriously quiet. Usually when you have that many big rigs running together, there's chatter. Drivers swap stories, share information about road conditions, joke about dispatchers and delivery deadlines. But my radio offered nothing except the occasional burst of static and the distant, indecipherable murmur of voices too far away to understand. I tried calling out on Channel 19, the standard trucker's frequency, but received no response from the convoy behind me. As we rolled through a wide valley between low mesas, I began to notice something else that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Every time I used my air horn to signal a lane change or acknowledge another driver, the sound seemed to echo from behind me. Not an echo in the traditional sense where sound bounces off canyon walls or overpasses, but something more deliberate, more synchronized. I tested this theory by giving 2 short blasts on my horn as we passed beneath a highway sign. Almost immediately, the sound came back to me, perfectly timed, perfectly pitched. 2 short blasts that seemed to originate from the entire convoy behind me, as if all 7 trucks had responded in perfect unison. The harmony was so precise it sent a chill crawling up my spine like cold fingers on bare skin. The miles rolled by, and the convoy maintained its eerie formation. I tried varying my speed, slowing down to 60, then accelerating to 80, but they matched every adjustment with mechanical precision. When I took the exit for a truck stop near Grants, New Mexico, hoping to break the strange formation, I watched in my mirrors as all 7 sets of headlights continued straight down the interstate without deviation. For a moment, relief washed over me as I pulled into the bright fluorescent oasis of the travel plaza. But as I sat in the parking lot, engine idling, trying to shake off the unsettled feeling that had been building in my chest, I saw them again. 7 sets of headlights maintaining their perfect spacing, waiting on the on-ramp like patient predators. They hadn't followed me into the truck stop, but they hadn't continued their journey either. They were simply waiting, engines presumably running, headlights cutting through the darkness like expectant eyes. I spent 15 minutes in that parking lot, buying coffee I didn't want, chatting with a dispatcher about weather conditions I already knew. Anything to convince myself that when I returned to the highway, the mysterious convoy would have moved on. But as I merged back onto Interstate 40, they fell into formation behind me again, exactly as before, as if those 15 minutes had never happened. The landscape began to change as we climbed into higher elevations, the desert giving way to pine forests and rocky outcroppings. The temperature dropped and I could see my breath misting slightly in the cab despite the heater running. The convoy behind me remained constant, an unwavering presence that had transformed from curiosity to concern to something approaching genuine fear. It was near the Colorado border when the horns began their true symphony. I had just navigated a series of sweeping curves that offered a spectacular view of the valley below when I decided to test my theory one more time. I gave a long sustained blast on my air horn, the kind of celebratory honk that truckers use to acknowledge particularly beautiful scenery or to greet a fellow driver after a long separation. What came back to me from the convoy was something that defied explanation. It wasn't simply an echo or even a mimicked response. It was harmony in the truest sense. 7 distinct horn voices joining together in a chord that seemed to resonate not just through the air, but through the very bones of the earth. The sound was hauntingly beautiful and deeply wrong at the same time, like a church choir made up of mechanical angels singing hymns for roads that led to places no living person should travel. The harmony lasted for nearly 30 seconds, rising and falling in complex patterns that suggested intelligence, intention, perhaps even emotion. When it finally faded, the silence that followed felt heavier than the darkness outside my windows. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel, and I realized I had been holding my breath, caught between fascination and terror at the impossible music echoing across the high desert. I tried to rationalize what I was experiencing. Maybe it was some kind of organized convoy, a group of drivers who had planned this elaborate display for reasons I couldn't fathom. Maybe it was a coincidence, multiple trucks with similar horns creating an acoustic illusion in the thin mountain air. But deep in my gut, where instinct lives beyond the reach of logic, I knew I was witnessing something that existed outside the normal rules of the highway. As we descended into Colorado, the convoy's behavior became even more disturbing. They began to respond to sounds I hadn't made, creating brief musical phrases that seemed to commentate on the landscape, the weather, even my own thoughts. When I passed the accident scene where emergency vehicles flashed their red and blue warnings into the night, the convoy's horns played a low, mournful dirge that made my skin crawl with its appropriateness and impossibility. Near Grand Junction, desperation finally overcame caution, and I made a series of sudden, dangerous moves to try to escape the convoy. I took an exit at the last possible second, gunned my engine through surface streets, even drove the wrong way down a one-way alley behind a closed shopping center. But no matter what evasive action I took, when I eventually found my way back to the interstate, they were there, waiting in perfect formation, ready to fall in behind me as if I had never left the highway at all. Dawn was beginning to paint the eastern sky in pale shades of pink and gold when I finally reached the outskirts of Denver. The convoy had followed me for over 400 miles, maintaining their supernatural synchronization, responding to my horn with increasingly complex harmonies that seemed to tell stories I couldn't understand but felt in my bones. As the first light of morning touched the Rocky Mountains, I prepared for what I hoped would be my final test. I pulled into the delivery dock at my destination, a warehouse complex on the industrial side of the city. As I backed up to the loading bay, I watched my mirrors intently, expecting to see the 7 sets of headlights waiting on the street beyond the chain-link fence, but the convoy was nowhere to be seen. The street was empty except for early morning commuters beginning their daily routines, utterly normal people living utterly normal lives who had no idea what strange music had played on the highway during the night. The warehouse workers unloaded my trailer with efficient indifference, and I completed my paperwork with hands that still trembled slightly from the night's experience. As I prepared to leave the facility, I gave one final blast on my air horn, partly out of habit and partly as a test to see if the mysterious convoy would respond one last time. For a moment, there was only the normal sounds of a city waking up. Then, faint but unmistakable, I heard it. The road that breathes from Marcus. The thing about driving nights on the interstate is that you start to notice patterns where there shouldn't be any. After 15 years hauling freight across the Midwest, I thought I'd seen every mile marker, every exit ramp, every stretch of cracked asphalt between Chicago and Denver. But Route 41 through western Nebraska had always been different, in ways that made my skin crawl even on the warmest summer evenings. It was past midnight when I first noticed the road breathing. That sounds crazy, I know, but there's no other way to describe what happened that October night as I guided my Peterbilt through the rolling darkness. The weather had turned nasty about 50 miles back, with sheets of rain hammering my windshield and the wipers working overtime to clear the glass. My headlights cut twin tunnels through the murk, revealing nothing but wet pavement stretching endlessly ahead. I'd driven this route hundreds of times before, always at night to avoid the heat and traffic. The road was supposed to be straight as an arrow for nearly 40 miles, with only one gentle curve near the abandoned grain elevator at mile marker 127. I knew every pothole, every faded lane marking, every reflector post along this stretch. But tonight, something felt wrong from the moment I passed the weathered sign welcoming travelers to Ashford County. The first sign of trouble came when my headlights swept across what should have been familiar terrain. Instead of the usual straight shot ahead, I found myself approaching a curve that didn't belong there. Not the gentle bend I expected near the grain elevator, but a sharp right turn that seemed to appear out of nowhere. My CB radio crackled with static, and even the reliable hum of my diesel engine seemed muffled somehow, as if the sound was being absorbed by the rain-soaked darkness around me. I downshifted carefully and took the unexpected curve at reduced speed, my trailer swaying slightly on the wet pavement. The road surface felt different beneath my tires, somehow softer, more yielding than good concrete should be. Through my side window, I caught glimpses of terrain that didn't match my memory of this area. Instead of the flat farmland that should stretch for miles in every direction, dark hills rose on both sides of the highway, their slopes covered with what looked like dense forest. My GPS unit flickered and went dark, then came back online, showing my position as a blinking dot in the middle of what appeared to be empty space. No roads, no landmarks, nothing but digital void. I tapped the screen with one finger, but the display remained stubbornly blank except for that lonely dot marking where I supposedly was. The rain intensified, drumming against my cab with a rhythm that almost sounded like breathing. Deep, slow inhalations followed by longer exhalations that seemed to match the rise and fall of those impossible hills flanking the highway. My headlights revealed pavement that appeared to ripple slightly in the beam, as if the asphalt was somehow fluid, responding to some unseen pressure from below. I tried to maintain my speed, telling myself this was just fatigue playing tricks with my perception. 15 hours behind the wheel could make anyone see things that weren't there. But the road continued to curve and twist in ways that defied everything I knew about this stretch of highway. Gentle rises became steep grades, and sections that should have been level ground dipped into valleys that had never existed before. The really unsettling part was how the road seemed to anticipate my truck's movements. When I needed to downshift for an approaching hill, the grade would level out just as my engine began to strain. When I touched my brakes before a curve, the turn would straighten into a gentle bend that required no reduction in speed. It was as if the highway was reading my intentions and reshaping itself accordingly, like some vast living thing trying to make me comfortable while leading me deeper into unknown territory. My fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, which should have been plenty to reach the truck stop at mile marker 162. But that familiar landmark never appeared. Instead, the road continued its impossible journey through terrain that grew stranger with each passing mile. The hills on either side seemed to pulse gently, rising and falling with that same breathing rhythm I heard in the rain. Dark shapes that might have been trees swayed without any wind, their movements synchronized with the undulation of the landscape. Through gaps in the strange forest, I caught glimpses of lights in the distance. Not the warm yellow glow of farmhouse windows or the clinical white glare of security floods, but soft blue radiance that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. The lights pulsed slowly, like bioluminescent organisms in the depths of the ocean, casting an ethereal glow on the low-hanging clouds. I reached for my CB radio again, hoping to raise another driver or maybe the dispatcher at our depot. The radio produced only soft static punctuated by what sounded almost like whispers just below the threshold of clear hearing. I adjusted the squelch and tried different channels, but the whispers followed me across the entire band, growing slightly louder whenever I slowed down or prepared to take one of the road's impossible turns. The pavement beneath my wheels had become distinctly spongy now, yielding to the weight of my loaded trailer with each tire rotation. Looking in my mirrors, I could see the surface slowly returning to its original shape after my dual wheels passed over it, like memory foam responding to pressure. The white and yellow lane markings seemed to glow with their own faint light, pulsing in gentle waves that traveled ahead of my truck as if the road was somehow aware of my approach. I began to notice a pattern in the landscape changes. Every time I started to feel truly concerned about my situation, the road would straighten out and the terrain would become more normal for a few miles. Rolling farmland would replace the breathing hills, and my headlights would reveal familiar-looking fence posts and grain fields. But just as I began to relax and convince myself that I'd somehow gotten back on the correct route, the changes would resume with renewed intensity. The whispers on the radio grew clearer during one of these transitions. I could almost make out words, spoken in what sounded like multiple voices layered on top of each other. They seemed to be offering directions or advice, but in a language that felt familiar without being quite comprehensible. When I tried to focus on understanding what they were saying, the voices would fade back into static, leaving me with only the sound of rain against my windshield and the increasingly labored breathing of the landscape around me. My odometer showed that I'd traveled nearly 80 miles since entering Ashford County, twice the distance that should have been possible on this stretch of highway. The fuel gauge had dropped to half full, which made sense given the extra mileage, but I still hadn't seen any of the landmarks that should mark my progress toward the Colorado border. No grain elevator, no truck stop, no exit signs for the tiny towns that dotted this part of Nebraska. The road began to descend into what appeared to be a vast valley filled with that same blue luminescence I'd been glimpsing between the trees. As my truck crested the hill and started down the long grade, I could see that the light came from some kind of massive clearing or lake in the valley floor. The surface appeared to be perfectly smooth and reflective, like dark water under moonlight, but it glowed with an inner radiance that cast moving shadows on the valley walls. My engine began to labor as we descended. Even though the grade shouldn't have required much braking effort, the transmission seemed sluggish and all my gauges showed readings that didn't quite make sense. Oil pressure was higher than normal, coolant temperature lower, and the tachometer needle moved in tiny oscillations that matched the breathing rhythm I'd been hearing in the rain all night. As I approached the valley floor, the road began to curve around the edge of whatever was producing that blue glow. I tried not to look directly at it, focusing instead on the lane markings ahead of my truck, but peripheral glimpses revealed a surface that seemed to be moving slowly, like thick liquid stirred by invisible currents. The whispers on my CB became more insistent, and I thought I could make out something that sounded like my name mixed in with the other voices. That's when I realized the road was beginning to narrow. The shoulders disappeared first, leaving only the 2 lanes of pulsing pavement suspended somehow above the glowing expanse. Then the lanes themselves began to contract, forcing me to reduce speed and focus all my attention on keeping my trailer from drifting off what remained of the highway. The surface beneath my tires felt increasingly unstable now, yielding more with each rotation of my wheels. In my mirrors, I could see the road slowly closing behind me like a zipper, the pavement folding in on itself and sinking toward that luminous surface below. There was no way to turn around, no way to back up, nothing to do but maintain, forward momentum and hoped the road would continue to exist long enough for me to reach solid ground on the other side of the valley. My speedometer showed 15 miles per hour as I crept across the narrowing bridge of living asphalt. The blue glow intensified, and I could feel warmth radiating up through the floor of my cab.